The rain was falling hard on the metal roofs of the old spaceport. Neon signs flickered in the wet darkness, painting the streets in red and blue light. The air smelled of rust, smoke, and cheap food. Ethan walked slowly down the narrow alley, his jacket soaked through, his boots splashing in shallow puddles. He had no real reason to be here, except that he had nowhere else to go. He had lost his cargo job 2 weeks ago when his small freighter broke down beyond repair. All his savings had gone into trying to fix it, but the ship was now a useless pile of metal sitting in a junkyard. He had just enough credits left to buy a warm meal or rent a bed for the night. Not both. The world felt cold and uncaring. He passed a row of grimy shop windows, each lit with soft yellow light. Behind one window stood a line of alien women, all dressed in thin clothing, their eyes watching passersby. Some had strange skin, colors, others had glowing tattoos. Some had extra arms or delicate wings folded against their backs. Most tried to smile at potential customers. Though the smiles did not reach their eyes, Ethan kept walking until one figure made him stop. She sat at the far end of the display room, away from the others. Her skin shimmered faintly under the light, a pale green with tiny silver flecks that caught every reflection. Her hair was long and damp, strands of deep violet falling over her shoulders. Her eyes were bright but full of fear. She did not try to call him over. She did not even look at the door. She simply stared at the floor as if she wished to vanish. The shopkeeper, a heavy-set alien with small black eyes, noticed Ethan's gaze. "She's new," the shopkeeper said, stepping closer with a smile that didn't feel friendly. "Quiet type, doesn't talk much, but she's easy to handle. I can let her go for one night, for half the usual price." Ethan looked at the girl again. She was shivering, even though the room was warm. There was a faint bruise on her shoulder, barely hidden by her thin dress. Something about her made Ethan's stomach twist. "How much?" he asked quietly. The shopkeeper told him. It was still more than Ethan wanted to spend, but the thought of leaving her here gnawed at him. He told himself it was foolish. She was a stranger. She was not his problem, yet his hand reached into his pocket, counting the credits. Minutes later, Ethan was leading her out of the building into the rain. She followed silently, her bare feet splashing in the puddles. The street was almost empty now, only a few drunks stumbling from one neon-lit door to another. Ethan's small rented room was only a few blocks away, up a narrow staircase that smelled faintly of mold. Inside, the room was little more than a bed, a table, and a tiny heating unit in the corner. Ethan gave her a towel and one of his clean shirts. She hesitated before taking it, glancing at him as if trying to read his intentions. "You can change," he said, turning away to give her privacy. When she sat on the bed, wrapped in his shirt, she looked smaller, more fragile. He gave her a cup of warm tea. She held it with both hands, as if afraid it would be taken away. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft and musical. It was the first word she had spoken since leaving the shop. "What's your name?" Ethan asked. She looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Lyra," she said. The name suited her, gentle but with a quiet strength hidden beneath. They talked a little, though most of the time she just listened. Ethan told her about losing his job, about the ship he once owned. Lyra said very little about herself, only that she had been taken from her homeworld and brought here against her will. She did not know if her family was alive. Ethan noticed how her fingers tightened around the cup whenever she spoke of her past. Hours passed quietly, the rain still tapping against the window. Ethan made up the bed for her and offered to sleep on the floor. She looked at him strangely, as if this was the first time someone had treated her like a person instead of property. "You're different from the others," she said softly. Ethan didn't reply, but her words stayed with him. That night, Ethan lay awake on the floor, listening to her steady breathing. He didn't know why he had brought her here, or why he cared so much about what happened to her, but something inside him told him this was not going to end with one night. Outside, footsteps passed in the hallway, slow and deliberate. Ethan's eyes opened, his hand moving toward the small knife under his pillow. Someone had stopped right outside his door. Asterisk, the footsteps outside the door did not move. Ethan's hand stayed tight on the handle of his knife. He could hear the faint creak of the wooden floorboards. A weight shifting slowly. Lyra was still asleep on the bed, her breathing soft and even, unaware of the shadow outside. A long moment passed before the footsteps began to fade away. The sound of the rain returned as the only noise, tapping softly against the glass. Ethan stayed awake for another hour, waiting, listening, until he was sure the stranger had gone. Only then did he let himself rest. When morning came, weak gray light filtered through the rain-streaked window. Ethan was already up, heating water on the small stove in the corner. Lyra stirred, sitting up slowly, the oversized shirt hanging loosely on her shoulders. She looked at him with a mixture of caution and curiosity. "You didn't touch me," she said quietly, as if still unsure it was real. Ethan glanced at her. "I didn't bring you here for that." Her lips trembled slightly. Then she looked down at her hands. "Most do," she whispered, almost to herself. Ethan didn't ask what she meant. He already knew. He gave her a bowl of warm porridge, and she ate slowly, savoring each bite as though it was the best thing she had tasted in years. They didn't speak much during breakfast, but there was a quiet understanding forming between them. He could see she was still tense, her eyes darting to every small sound outside. She had lived too long expecting harm. Around mid-morning, there was a heavy knock on the door. Ethan's muscles tightened instantly. He opened it to see the shopkeeper standing there. His black eyes narrowed. "You had her for the night," the man said. "Now she comes back." Lyra's hands gripped the blanket tightly, fear flashing in her gaze. Ethan stepped into the doorway, blocking the view of her. "She's not ready to go back," he said. The shopkeeper's lips curled. "She doesn't have a choice, and neither do you." Ethan felt a cold anger rise inside him. "How much to keep her?" he asked, his voice steady. The shopkeeper laughed. You don't have that kind of money, but if you want to dream, I'll name the price." The number he gave was far more than Ethan had. Still, he didn't back down. "Give me time, I'll earn it." The man sneered. "You've got 2 nights. After that, someone else takes her, someone who'll pay triple." When the shopkeeper left, Lyra stared at Ethan. "You can't," she said firmly. "It's too much. You shouldn't waste it on me." Ethan shook his head. "It's not a waste." She blinked, confused. "Why?" "Because you deserve better than this," he said simply. The rest of the day, Ethan searched for work. He took whatever jobs he could find, hauling crates in the rain, cleaning engine rooms for half the normal pay, carrying supplies through the maze of docks. Every credit mattered, but it still felt like pouring water into a cracked cup. By nightfall, his muscles ached, and he was soaked to the bone. Lyra was waiting with a small pot of stew she had somehow made with the few ingredients he had. The smell filled the room, warm and comforting. They ate together, and for the first time, she told him more about her past. She had been taken from a peaceful coastal village on her planet, captured by traders who sold her to different owners across star systems. She had been passed from one cruel hand to another, until she ended up in that shop window. Her voice shook when she spoke of the things she had endured, but she didn't cry. Ethan realized she had learned to bury her pain deep. Later that night, as the fire in the heater flickered low, Lyra sat beside him on the floor. "You shouldn't do this for me," she said again. "You'll only get yourself hurt." Ethan met her gaze. "Maybe, but I'm not going to just watch you be taken away." For a moment, something in her eyes softened. She leaned back against the wall, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it told him more than words could. Outside, the rain had eased to a slow drizzle. The sounds of the spaceport grew quiet as the night deepened. Ethan lay awake again, thinking of the short time left before the shopkeeper's deadline. He didn't have enough yet, and tomorrow would bring new dangers. But one thing was clear. One night with Lyra had changed everything. He was no longer just a man trying to survive. Now, he was a man with something, someone, worth fighting for. The morning came with the sound of engines rumbling outside the window. Cargo ships were lifting off from the docks, their exhaust clouds drifting across the skyline. Ethan sat at the small table, counting the coins and credits he had earned the day before. It was not even half of what he needed. The shopkeeper's voice from yesterday echoed in his mind, 2 nights. After that, she's gone. Lyra was quiet as she folded the blanket, her long violet hair falling forward to hide her face. She had not asked him how much he had made, but Ethan knew she was thinking about it when she finally looked at him. Her eyes were calm but distant. "You don't have to do this," she said. "If I go back, it's just what always happens." Her words were flat, like someone who had stopped hoping a long time ago. Ethan leaned forward. "Lyra, I don't want to give you back. I want to keep you safe." She almost smiled, but it faded quickly. No one can buy safety. "Ethan," he stood up, pulling on his jacket. "Then I'll buy your freedom, and we'll make safety ourselves." The day passed in a blur of work. Ethan lifted heavy cargo until his back ached, cleaned greasy ship engines until his hands were black, and ran errands across the rain-slick streets. But even with the extra hours, he was still far from the total. When night fell, he walked past the shop again. The lights inside were dim, but he saw the shopkeeper speaking to a tall alien in an expensive coat. The coat's fabric shimmered like liquid metal, and the man's cold eyes scanned the display room. Lyra was not there. She was still at Ethan's room, but the sight made his stomach turn. The shopkeeper spotted Ethan and stepped outside with a sly grin. "You're cutting it close," he said. "That man in there, he's offering triple in cash right now." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I told you I'd pay." The shopkeeper shrugged. "And I told you, 2 nights, final." Ethan took a breath. "What if I give you something else? Work, service, whatever you need, until the rest is paid." The shopkeeper's grin widened. "Anything?" he asked, testing Ethan's resolve. Ethan nodded without hesitation. "Anything, fine," the shopkeeper said. "You pay me what you have tomorrow, and then you work for me until the rest is covered. No complaints, no quitting, deal?" Ethan knew it could be dangerous. Working for a man like this meant getting pulled into shady and risky jobs, but there was no other choice. "Deal," he said, his voice firm. When Ethan returned to his room, Lyra was sitting by the small heater, her knees drawn up to her chest. She looked up at him, reading his expression instantly. "You did something," she said quietly. "I made an agreement," Ethan replied. "I'll pay part tomorrow, and then work off the rest." Her eyes widened. "Ethan, that man, he's not someone you want to." "Oh, I don't care," Ethan said. "I'm not letting him sell you." There was a long silence, broken only by the soft hiss of the heater. Then Lyra's voice came, low and unsteady. "No one has ever tried to keep me before, not like this." Ethan sat beside her. "Then maybe it's time someone did." For a moment, she just stared at him, as if trying to decide whether to believe it was real. Finally, she gave a small nod, the faintest trace of a smile touching her lips. The next morning, Ethan walked back to the shop with the coins. He had the shopkeeper took them without counting, already knowing the rest would come through the work Ethan had promised. "You start tonight," the man said. "Don't be late." The job was not explained, and Ethan didn't ask, but he knew it would not be honest work. Still, his thoughts were on Lyra. This was the only way to keep her with him. That evening, Lyra waited for him with a simple meal ready. They ate together in quiet. When he told her he would be working late for the shopkeeper, she only nodded, though her eyes betrayed her worry. Before he left, she reached out and took his hand. "Come back," she whispered. Ethan squeezed her fingers gently. "I will." As he stepped into the rain-soaked streets, Ethan felt the weight of his choice settle over him. He was walking into something dangerous, but for the first time in a long time, he had a reason worth risking everything. Lyra was not just someone he wanted to protect. She was someone he could not imagine losing. And now, the clock was ticking faster than ever. The night air was heavy with the smell of rain and engine smoke. Ethan walked toward the shopkeeper's back office, his boots splashing through shallow puddles. The alley was darker than the main street, lit only by a single flickering lamp when he entered. The shopkeeper was waiting with two other men, both armed, both watching Ethan closely. "You're going to deliver something for me," the shopkeeper said. Sliding a small metal case across the desk, Ethan glanced at it, the weight of the job already pressing on his mind. "What's inside?" he asked. "Not your concern," the man replied coldly. "Just take it to Dock 7 before midnight, and don't open it." Ethan didn't need to ask why the job had to be done in secret. He knew this was smuggling, and probably dangerous, but every hour he worked was a step toward Lyra's freedom. He took the case, nodded, and left. The docks at night were a maze of shadows and echoes. Cargo cranes loomed overhead, their outlines sharp against the dim light of distant flood lamps. Workers moved quickly, avoiding eye contact. Ethan kept to the edges, his eyes scanning for trouble. He reached Dock 7 without incident. But as he approached the designated ship, two uniformed port guards stepped out from behind a stack of crates. "Stop," one of them ordered, holding up a hand. Ethan's grip tightened on the handle of the case. "Cargo inspection," the other said, stepping closer. Ethan's mind raced. If they opened the case, it would be over before it began. Thinking fast, he shifted the case under his arm and knocked over a nearby crate with his boot, spilling metal parts across the walkway. The noise was loud enough to draw their attention for a moment, and in that instant, Ethan slipped into the shadows and disappeared down a side path. He delivered the case to a silent figure waiting in the shadows of the ship's loading ramp. The figure gave no thanks, only took the case and walked away. Ethan returned to the shopkeeper with nothing but a damp jacket and a racing heartbeat. The man smirked. "You're quick, I'll give you that," he said. "Tomorrow night, there's more." For the next few days, Ethan worked job after job for the shopkeeper, moving packages, carrying messages, guarding suspicious meetings. The work was tense and often dangerous, but each time he came home, Lyra was there, waiting. She kept the small room warm, made what little food they had last, and listened quietly when Ethan told her pieces of what he was doing, though he never gave her the dangerous details. One night, Ethan returned later than usual, his face pale and his shirt stained with dirt and blood. Lyra rushed to him, her hands trembling as she checked him for wounds. "It's not mine," he assured her, "just someone else's mess I had to walk through." But his eyes told a different story. Whatever had happened, it had been close, too close. Lyra sat beside him as he drank the hot tea she made. "You're doing this for me?" she said quietly. "And it's hurting you." Ethan shook his head. "It's not hurting me. It's reminding me why I need to get you out of here." Her eyes softened, and she reached out to place her hand over his. "I'm not worth your life," she whispered. Ethan looked at her with a seriousness she had never seen before. "You're worth more than that." The following evening, as Ethan left for another job, he noticed a group of thugs lingering near the stairwell of the building. Their eyes followed him as he walked past. By the time he returned hours later, the hallway door was slightly open. Panic gripped him. He ran up the stairs and pushed into his room. Inside, Lyra was in the corner, clutching a metal pipe, her chest rising and falling fast. "There were men," she said breathlessly. "They tried to open the door, but I told them you'd be back any second, and they left." Ethan's hands curled into fists. He knew exactly who had sent them. Someone who wanted to scare him, maybe drive him into making a mistake. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat by the door with his knife in hand, listening to every creak and shift of the building. Lyra lay awake on the bed, watching him silently. Neither spoke, but the unspoken truth hung in the air. The danger was growing, and soon, it would reach a breaking point. By morning, Ethan had made up his mind. He would work double shifts, take on the worst jobs. Whatever it took to pay the debt faster, the shopkeeper would. Not control their lives forever. And the next time someone tried to take Lyra away, Ethan would be ready. The night after the attempted break-in, Ethan's body ached from both exhaustion and tension. He had barely slept, his knife never leaving his hand. Lyra moved quietly in the small room, heating water and preparing the little food they had left. She glanced at him often, her eyes holding both worry and something softer, something she hadn't shown before. When she set the steaming cup of tea in front of him, Ethan almost smiled. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. "You should rest," she replied, sitting across from him. "If you keep going like this, you'll collapse before you pay the debt." He shook his head. "I can't stop now. Not when we're this close." Lyra lowered her gaze to the table, tracing a finger over a scratch in the wood. "I used to think no one cared if I lived or died," she said quietly. "Then you showed up and made me doubt that." Her words sank into him, heavier than anything else he'd heard in weeks. He realized then that all the risk, all the danger, wasn't just about protecting her. It was because he couldn't imagine a life without her in it. That evening, Ethan took a smaller job for the shopkeeper, guarding a warehouse while a shipment was unloaded. It was supposed to be easy, but halfway through the night, a fight broke out between two drunken workers. Ethan stepped in to break it up, but one of them swung a pipe and caught him hard on the shoulder. Pain shot down his arm, and though he managed to finish the job, by the time he got home, his shirt was torn and his skin was bruised. Lyra's face turned pale when she saw him. She pulled him to the bed, making him sit while she fetched a damp cloth. "You said you'd be careful," she scolded softly, dabbing at the bruise. "I was," Ethan said with a small smirk. "This is careful." She shook her head, but didn't argue, her hands gentle as she cleaned the dirt from his skin. In that moment, Ethan saw something in her he hadn't noticed before, the way she focused on his comfort before her own. The way her touch lingered just enough to show she cared. It wasn't just gratitude, it was something deeper. For a long time, neither of them spoke, the quiet between them feeling warmer than any words could. Over the next 2 days, Ethan's injury slowed him down, forcing him to take lighter jobs. It frustrated him, but it also gave him more time with Lyra. They talked more now, sometimes about small, meaningless things, other times about the past. She told him about the ocean on her homeworld, how the water glowed at night with soft blue light, how she used to sneak out as a child to watch the waves. Ethan listened, picturing her there, free and unafraid. One evening, as they ate together, Lyra's voice turned serious. "If you free me, what then?" she asked. "Where will we go?" Ethan leaned back, thinking, somewhere far from here, maybe a quiet colony, maybe your homeworld if it's safe. She studied him carefully. "And you'd come with me?" "Of course," he said, without hesitation. "I'm not letting you go alone." Her eyes softened, but there was still doubt in them. "Why?" she asked, almost like she was afraid of the answer. Ethan met her gaze. "Because somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking of this as saving you, and started thinking of it as being with you." For a moment, she didn't move, didn't even breathe. Then she reached across the table and took his hand, her fingers curling around his, as if she was afraid he might disappear. The moment was broken by a knock at the door. Both of them froze. Ethan stood, hand on his knife. Before opening it, just enough to see a small boy holding a folded piece of paper. The boy handed it over and ran without a word. Inside was a short note in the shopkeeper's handwriting. "Final payment due tomorrow, or she's gone." Ethan's stomach tightened. He had enough to cover most of it, but not all. Lyra saw the look on his face. "What is it?" she asked. He handed her the note, and she read it slowly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I'll get the rest," Ethan said, his voice low and determined. "No matter what I have to do." That night, Lyra didn't sleep. She sat by the small heater, watching him as he paced the room, planning, thinking. She realized something then. She wasn't afraid of what would happen to her anymore. She was afraid of what might happen to him, and in that moment, she understood the truth she had been trying to ignore. She had fallen in love with the man who had rented her for one night, and then fought for her every day since. The night air was sharp and cold. Ethan walked quickly through the dim streets, his mind locked on the deadline. By tomorrow. He needed the final payment, or the shopkeeper would take Lyra away forever. Every step he took seemed louder than the rest of the world, as if time itself was counting down with him. When he reached the shopkeeper's back office, the man was waiting, leaning against the desk with a smirk. "You're in luck," the shopkeeper said. "I have a job that will clear the rest of your debt in one night." Ethan's jaw tightened. "What's the job?" The man tossed a small metal cylinder into Ethan's hands. "Deliver this to Dock 13 by sunrise. No questions, and don't get caught." Ethan didn't have to ask what was inside. It was valuable, and dangerous enough to make him a target. One mistake and he wouldn't to whose Lo Salida he'd lose his life. But there was no other way. He nodded once. Fine. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still slick, reflecting the glow of distant neon signs. Ethan kept to the shadows as he made his way toward the docks. He felt eyes on him more than once, and his hand never left the grip of his knife. He knew the shopkeeper wasn't the only one watching this delivery. Halfway there, he heard footsteps behind him, fast and deliberate. He ducked into an alley just as two figures ran past. Scanning the street, he waited until they were gone, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He didn't have time to relax. He still had to cross the cargo district, the most dangerous part of the port at night. Dock 13 was in sight when the trouble came. 3 men stepped out from behind a stack of crates, blocking his path. "Hand it over," one of them said, his voice low and threatening. Ethan's eyes flicked between them, 2 with knives, 1 with a short metal pipe. "If you want it." "You'll have to take it," he replied. The first man lunged, and Ethan sidestepped, slamming his elbow into the attacker's ribs. The second swung his knife, grazing Ethan's jacket. Ethan countered with a quick strike, knocking the blade away. The third came at him with the pipe, but Ethan ducked low, driving his shoulder into the man's stomach and sending him sprawling. Breathing hard, Ethan didn't wait to see if they would get up. He ran by the time he reached the dock. The first hint of pale light was touching the horizon. A tall alien in a black coat was waiting beside a small transport ship. Ethan handed over the cylinder without a word. The alien weighed it in his hand, nodded once, and walked up the ramp without looking back. Ethan stood there for a moment, the tension slowly draining from his body. The job was done, and the debt would be paid, but he knew the shopkeeper would make him wait until the last moment before letting Lyra go. He turned and headed back through the sleeping streets. The ache in his muscles matched only by the fire in his chest, a need to see her, to tell her they had one. When he reached the room, Lyra was sitting by the heater, her eyes heavy with worry. She jumped to her feet when she saw him. "You're hurt," she said, noticing the fresh cuts on his arm. "I'm fine," he replied, his voice softer now. "It's over, Lyra. I have it, all of it." For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, holding on as if afraid he might vanish. He rested his chin on her hair, breathing in the faint scent of lavender that always clung to her. "It's almost morning," she murmured. "What happens now?" "Now," he said, "we make sure no one can ever take you away again." They sat together until the sun began to rise. The light spilled through the window, catching in Lyra's silver-flecked skin. For the first time since they met, Ethan saw her smile without hesitation. There was still one final step left, handing the payment to the shopkeeper and walking away with her for good. But in his heart, Ethan already knew, whatever came after this, they wouldn't face it alone. The shopkeeper's door creaked open with the same rusty groan Ethan had heard too many times before. Inside, the man sat behind his desk, counting stacks of credits with slow, deliberate hands. Ethan stepped forward and placed the final payment on the table. Every coin and chip earned through sweat, bruises, and sleepless nights. The shopkeeper looked up with that sly grin Ethan had grown to hate. "Well," the man said, pushing the pile together, "I suppose she's yours now." Ethan kept his voice steady. "No more deals, no more conditions. She's free." The shopkeeper leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. "Free? Yes. But freedom isn't cheap out here. Someone like her attracts attention. Someone might still come looking." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then I'll be the one they have to go through." With a careless wave of his hand, the shopkeeper called toward the back room. Moments later, Lyra stepped out, her violet hair falling loosely over her shoulders, her silver-flecked skin catching the dull light. Her eyes locked on Ethan's, and, for the first time since he met her, they were not filled with fear. Instead, they held something brighter, hope. She crossed the room slowly, as if afraid the moment might vanish if she moved too fast. When she reached him, Ethan took her hand, his grip firm, reassuring. "It's done," he said softly. "You're coming with me now." The shopkeeper's grin returned as he counted the last of the credits. "She's all yours. But remember, in this part of the galaxy, ownership is only as strong as your ability to keep it." Ethan didn't reply. He simply turned and led Lyra out into the morning light. The streets of the spaceport were quieter than usual, the rain-washed air smelling faintly of metal and fuel. They walked side by side, the noise of distant engines and the hum of neon signs fading behind them. Lyra looked around as if seeing the city for the first time, not as a cage, but as a place she was finally free to leave. "Where will we go?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Ethan glanced at her, a small smile touching his lips. "Anywhere we want." They made their way to the small cargo skiff Ethan had borrowed for work. It was old and dented, but it could fly, and that was enough. As they loaded what little they had, a blanket, a few tools, a small bag of food, Lyra paused, her eyes distant. "I never thought I'd walk out of that place without chains," she said quietly. Ethan stepped closer. "You're not just walking out. You're walking toward something better." When they finally lifted off, the spaceport grew smaller beneath them, a tangle of lights and steel fading into the gray clouds. Lyra sat beside him in the cockpit, her fingers brushing the window as she stared at the open sky. For the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe without fear. Hours later, they landed on a quiet moon colony, far from the trade routes. It was a small settlement with stone buildings and wide fields under a pale golden sky. Ethan had chosen it because few people came here, and those who did minded their own business. They rented a small house at the edge of the settlement, with a worn wooden porch and a view of the hills. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. The first night there, Lyra stood outside, looking up at the stars. Ethan joined her, standing close, enough for their shoulders to touch. "Do you miss your homeworld?" he asked. She thought for a moment. "Yes, but maybe I can build a new one here." He turned to her. "We'll build it together." The days that followed were quiet. Ethan found work repairing farm equipment and small transport shuttles. Lyra tended a small garden, filling the air around their home with the scent of growing herbs and flowers. At night, they would sit on the porch, watching the twin moons rise over the hills. One evening, as they shared a simple meal, Lyra set her cup down and looked at him with a steady gaze. "When you first took me from that place, I thought it was only for one night," she said. Ethan smiled faintly. "So did I, but you stayed," she continued, her voice soft. "You fought for me when you didn't have to. And somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking of myself as something bought, and started thinking of myself as yours." Ethan reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "You were never just something I bought, Lyra," he said. "You were someone I found. Someone I couldn't let go." She squeezed his hand gently, a smile breaking through. "Then, I guess you bought me forever," she teased, her tone light, but her eyes shining. They laughed together softly, the sound blending with the quiet night wind. In that small house on the edge of a forgotten moon, they had nothing grand, no riches, No power, no fame, but they had each other. And for both of them, that was worth more than anything the galaxy could offer.